Hey everyone, Rose here, and it's retopology time. This video is part 2 of a short series I'm working on a 3D model of this here character Plushmellow, who I was commissioned to make. In part 1 I made the base high poly sculpt, so if you haven't seen that, feel free to go check that out. In this video I'll be starting with retopology. This part of the process always takes really long for me, and even more so with this model because it's quite complicated, especially the mane. So I split it up into 2 parts, and in this video I'll just be doing the head and all the things that kind of belong to it. And there'll be another video at some later date where I retopologize the rest of the body. For those of you who aren't quite sure what retopology is, a super quick summary. When you sculpt something like a character, you usually end up with a mesh that's really high poly. In this case, it actually has several million polygons making up the surface. That's not great because you can't UV unwrap the character, and you can't rig them or pose them or animate them, and even rendering takes really long. Retopology is essentially the process of modeling a whole new surface over the top of the model. That way it's lower poly, but it still keeps all the major details, and now it can be rigged and animated and all that stuff. The polygons also need to be kind of oriented in a specific way so that deformations especially are smooth and you don't get any weird artifacts from shaders. If you've seen some of my other retopology videos in the past, you'll know I sometimes use retopo. In this case I didn't because the advantages weren't really that massive and I could work pretty fine with just Blender's default tools, so I just stuck to them. I turned on snapping up at the top of the screen, set it to faces, and set it to project individual elements. Then I added in a plane, added a shrink wrap modifier to that, set it to above surface, and added just a little bit of distance to the surface so that I can see stuff better, and it kind of shrinks down a bit when I add a subdivision surface modifier, so that kind of works out. I also make sure the shrink wrap modifier is set to the high poly head, which is obviously the object I'm trying to shrink wrap around. Another thing I do is go into the properties menu, go to tools and options and turn on auto merge. That allows me to merge vertices automatically just by moving them really close together. As you can see, the first thing I worked on was the face. I opened up a couple of references for face topology, both for animals and humans. Faces have a couple of very important face loops that allow the mesh to deform properly when you try and animate it, especially around things like the eyes, the mouth, and in this case also the snout. So it's really helpful to have a couple of references open so you get a rough idea where everything needs to be and you don't forget any important parts. I also have several materials on my mesh, as you can see, and I assigned them different colors in the viewport. That way I can more easily identify where all my important loops are, and I can make sure they connect up in the way I want them to, and I don't have any awkward like triangles or weird connecty vertices in places where I don't want them. Speaking of weird connecty vertices and triangles, in the face I try and keep my topology just even quads as much as possible. That means all my faces have 4 edges, and they're not like super long or super squished. I also keep an eye on my poles. Poles are vertices that have more or less than 3 edges connected to them. They're very important to make sure all your edges flow in the right direction, but if you put them in the wrong place they can really cause some issues and like cause the mesh to deform a bit weirdly. I avoid putting any poles in that have less than 3 connected sides, which would be kind of weird, or more than 5. Those kind of cause a lot of shading artifacts when you just have them lying around. And I also make sure all my poles, which have 3 or 5 sides connected, are placed in good situations for deforming. So like at the sides of the cheeks and between the eye and the snout there is one, and in a couple of other places. These aren't like solid rules, and they're definitely situations where you're going to want to deliberately break them and have like triangles or something, or even n-gons with 5 edges or so at some point in your mesh, and there are situations where you need or want to have poles with more than 5 sides. But it takes a while to kind of figure everything out and understand where what works and what doesn't, so in general I find just trying to stick to even quad topology is relatively safe, especially in something as important as the face, where it would be really obvious and annoying if something deforms weirdly. I was actually done with the face really quickly for this model, which is nice because that means I've been getting better at retopology. But as you can see by the length of the video, there's still a whole lot of stuff to do, specifically the mane, which ended up taking ages because it's just kind of all over the place. Since I'm done with the face, I won't go to the ears for a quick moment and just add a big edge loop around the edge of the ear. I don't do any filling in or anything like that yet, but I wanted a general idea. I actually separate this part of the mesh with P and make it its own object. That makes stuff a lot easier because I don't get in my way with different parts of the mesh and don't like accidentally select something that I don't want to select and cause myself a whole bunch of issues. In the end, I can easily merge them together and just bridge all the weird gaps and stuff like that. And now it's time to start working on by far the most time-consuming and difficult part of this process, the mane. Again, I use P to separate out the piece into a separate object so I can work on it without interfering with the other pieces. And then I get to work. This was especially difficult and, as I said, time-consuming for a couple of reasons. Specifically, the mane is made up of a bunch of different parts just kind of sticking out in pretty much random directions. That obviously looks nice as fur, but it's very difficult to kind of organize that into loops and stuff that face in a proper direction. It was especially challenging in this case because this model is going to be relatively high poly when it's done, and it's going to have a subdivision surface modifier on top of it, meaning I can't just bake in any missing details with a normal map. All the details that I want to have in the finished model have to be there in the retopology. It also means I can't take any shortcuts and just cover something in like a super big kind of wonky shape. I have to actually make sure everything is covered with a decent topology. It doesn't have to be like a perfect A+ topology as long as I don't have any weird shading artifacts, and my edge loops go in a relatively reasonable direction. I can get away with some stuff like slightly weird poles and triangles here and there. In fact, the triangles are actually quite practical in places because they allow me to just end an edge loop that I want to end instead of having it just spiral around the rest of the whole model. At first I tried to approach the whole mane with a very systematic approach, going around each part of the mesh with a basic edge loop, defining all the edges of the clumps of fur and all that, and then filling it in afterwards. I even tried assigning all my regular old colors that I had from the face to the edges around the fur to make everything a bit more easy and visible and manageable. But in the end I found this approach just didn't work really well, just because everything is made up of such random pieces. For the face I could relatively easily make a bunch of separate loops and then connect them up, but that didn't really work with the fur here because the outlining loops wouldn't be fully separate, they would kind of connect up in awkward ways, and the whole filling in process with the pre-outlined edge loops made it a bit hard, so I ended up switching strategy a bit later on. After working on all this fur for a while, I decided to go back to the ears for a bit and mess around with them. I make some adjustments to my surrounding loop, tweak the direction of it in a couple of places, and just make sure it properly sticks to the edge of the ear and isn't like super wonky or overlapping too much with the base mesh. Then I fill in the top and slowly just bridge over the whole thing. Then I can easily just use Shift R to add more edge loops and just snap them to the surface, and that way I can super quickly fill everything, both on the inside and later on the outside, with a very straightforward grid. The ears actually had this super simple topology. The only vaguely interesting thing is a single little diamond at the base of the ear on the top, which I used to add just 2 extra edge loops around the bottom so that everything fit properly, and I didn't have some really stretched or uneven topology on the top. They aren't quite done the way they are now, and I'll still work on them a bit later, but they really don't change much in terms of their base topology. And now it's back to working on the mane. I fill all the stuff in that I've already laid out, and in the meantime also decide on a proper strategy for the rest of the mane. I look around and find the important parts of the mesh that actually need supporting edge loops. That would be, for one, the tight creases in between the chunks of fur, as well as in some places on the chunks of fur, which is actually what I had already been outlining in the first place, so I wasn't really that far off. I also add thin edge loops to the sharper edges I have along some of the hairs. Those actually follow the curve or the flow of the chunks of fur, so they're very important to keep everything supported and also maintain the detail that I need in my final model. And the last thing I want to do is make sure I have a loop around all the sticky outy bits kind of the model. It's a bit hard to describe what I specifically mean, but essentially most of each chunk of fur is kind of, let's say, buried in the rest of the fur, but there's always a bit of a sharp end that sticks out, kind of like a cone. And for something like a cone, I try and keep it with a cylindrical kind of topology, so I have one loop wrapping around the tip completely, and then I extrude it out and fill in the tip to make sure that has a nice proper cylindrical topology. For the mane here, I decide that the topology doesn't need to be quite as perfect as on the face, since it isn't going to be deforming as much, and any like shading artifacts wouldn't be noticeable, especially if it's in something like this tight crease in between hairs. So throughout this part of the model I have a couple of like long-ish quads. I also have quite a few small triangles which I use to just end edge loops that I want to end. I also have many places where my edge loops kind of go around in weird directions and spiral around all over the place. Around the face, where I could just easily close up my loop into pretty much a circle, that was very easy to avoid, but in this case, because it's just everything is sticking out in all kinds of different directions, it's really not avoidable that some of my loops that were pretty much just outlining, say, a chunk of fur, go out and move and like wind along random parts of the model and do other stuff. Either way, despite my couple of hurdles in the beginning, I eventually got comfortable with the process and managed to finish everything up quite nicely, even though it took a long time. As you guys might have already noticed if you're watching this video when it goes up, I'm quite a bit off my usual schedule. I usually try and upload every Tuesday, and that's just because I'm quite busy at the moment, so I'm just kind of squeezing my 3D modeling time as well as my editing time in between other important stuff I need to do. So I also don't have time to narrate the whole process. In fact, I've already actually been narrating a bit more than I planned and a bit more than I really have time for. So I won't be saying that much throughout the rest of the project. I'll just be chiming in every once in a while with some things that I think are somewhat important. I'll try and divide up the video into chapters so you can easily skip around and see different parts that you're interested in. And I hope you guys can still learn something from the whole process. That being said, before I leave you guys with just some music, there's still a couple of relatively important things I feel like I should mention. There are quite a few different things and changes that I do on and off throughout the whole process. One thing I do really often and has been really helpful so far is going into sculpt mode, using the slide and relax brush and holding shift just carefully smooth out and even out the topology. I've also been messing around in the object properties menu, specifically under viewport display. I turn on and off the wireframe option quite a lot when I'm in object mode, depending on whether I want to make sure my normals and my subdivision surface modifier look correct, or whether I want to see whether my topology is looking correct. Further down in the drop-down menu, I also switch between textured or solid and wireframe relatively frequently, especially when I'm modeling in edit mode. For example, I just right now switched from wireframe back into solid and back to wireframe. Wireframe helps me see the underlying structure, things like sharp creases and edges on my base mesh that I want to maintain, while solid helps me see the retopologized mesh itself. Both have advantages and disadvantages, so it's very practical to just have that menu open and switch between them so I can take a look at both pretty easily. Another thing in that menu I turn on and off quite a lot, though I did that more in the beginning than later on, would be the in front option. In front means that all of my model, even if it's overlapping or technically behind another model, displays as if it were in front. That way I wouldn't have these weird sticky throughy bits of my model. And though those could be a bit annoying, there are also more situations I think where it's annoying when you can see stuff through the back or where you just can't see the underlying mesh at all. So I keep it off more throughout the latter end of the modeling process, but it's still useful every once in a while, especially if I want to take a look at the topology of the retopologized part, I guess, without having the base mesh just peeking through and obstructing my view. Beyond things having to do with the display, there's also a couple of other things that are relatively relevant to my process. For one, it's the snapping. I have snapping on for 99% of the process, but every once in a while there are very specific situations where it gets annoying. So because snapping is set to project individual origins, it automatically snaps everything to the side of the model I'm looking at, which is really annoying if I want to extrude a cylinder around something like a piece of hair. So for those situations, I just turn snapping off for a moment, extrude out, and just rely on the shrink wrap modifier to project everything to the surface the way I want it. However, that can cause a little bit of problems, especially when you have the shrink wrap modifier displaying in edit mode, because then the vertices aren't actually where they look like they are on the model. Because obviously shrink wrap is moving them, but only kind of visually, or only essentially after the modeling process. So to make sure all my vertices actually are where they're supposed to be, I occasionally just go into object mode, duplicate the shrink wrap modifier, and then just apply one version to make sure all my vertices are properly snapped to the surface and I don't have any that are just kind of flying around somewhere off the edge and only look like they're on the surface because they're being pushed there by the shrink wrap modifier. I hope that made sense. And another very similar thing, I mentioned earlier that I have auto merge turned on, which is very practical, again, like 99% of the time, because it means I can, for example, extrude a piece of model and just hold it relatively close to another piece, and the vertices just automatically merge, and I don't have to like constantly go pressing M and merge and all that stuff. But I do run into a couple of problems, especially when I'm working on something like the tips of the furs, where the individual kind of vertices are very, very close together. And I very often run into issues where when I'm working in places like that, I accidentally snap stuff together that I didn't actually want to merge. And so when I'm working in super tight spots, I tend to turn off auto merge temporarily. If I do that, I usually use M and then by distance afterwards to make sure I didn't like accidentally keep two overlapping vertices rather than having them merge, because I forgot that I have auto merge turned off. And now a couple of final points on topology. I already mentioned in the beginning that I try and keep everything equal, so like all my faces have a relatively even height and width, and they also don't have like weird squished angles, but everything stays relatively right angled. That being said, obviously if you just continue that around, you tend to have situations where your row of edge loops kind of, or like your grid, I would say, starts to squeeze super tight towards one side or stretch really far towards the other side, and you probably don't want that. So you'll need a way to kind of expand the number of vertices you have, or the number of edges you have in an edge loop. And like the easiest way I find to do that, and the one I do by far the most often, is simply adding a little diamond. So you split one of your edges apart, and just rather than like merging it back together, you fill it with another another quad, but that one is turned in a slightly different direction. Now, I wouldn't do that inside very important edge loops, because that actually redirects your edge loop, because both of the loops you have coming from the side are now going to essentially split off at a right angle and now go essentially at a right angle to how they were before, which is fine in some situations, and in fact you want that in some situations. Like in some situations you're trying to reroute your edge loop around a right angle, but if you want to keep your edge loop around a specific thing and keep it in a specific shape, obviously you don't want that to just kind of randomly reroute into a different direction. So definitely be careful where you put those kind of diamonds and rerouting bits. Now, there are going to be situations where you don't want to split your single edge into 3, but rather just split it into 2, because what a diamond does is it splits it into 3, so it kind of adds 2 extra bits, but you can't keep it quads and split it into 2. So your only real way of doing that is adding a triangle, which a lot of people will say you should never do, and you have to avoid tris and n-gons and stuff at all costs. But really that isn't the case. It actually goes down to like how your computer actually processes polygons. Everything is actually just a trie in the end. It just kind of like, even if you look at stuff in edit mode, like you take a quad and really push the shape of it, you'll start to notice that it actually makes like an imaginary edge where you don't have an edge, but it essentially divides all your quads into triangles anyway. So there isn't really any problem in terms of deformation if you have triangles there, as long as they aren't in like a super awkward spot where they're going to interfere with like your edge loops and pushing and pulling around. Triangles are also useful, as I mentioned, when you're like in situations where you want or where you have to have only one extra loop, or you just have a loop just floating around that you want to end and you don't want to have it spiraling around all over the place. Another thing about triangles and n-gons, especially in this kind of model, is that when you add a subdivision surface modifier on top of them, it actually automatically turns everything into quads. So where your triangle or your n-gon was, n-gon being a face with more than 4 sides, so 5 or more. Anyway, your n-gons and your triangles actually just automatically turn into quads and essentially become a pole. So yeah, don't worry too much about having everything be perfectly quads. In a lot of places it's still better to have quads than to have like triangles or n-gons, but if you don't have them and occasionally you have a triangle or an n-gon somewhere in a corner, it's not the end of the world either. Anyway, that's about it for the important or interesting stuff I have to say for now. I'll come back when any new part of the process starts or there's something interesting for me to say. Up until then, enjoy some music and see you all in a bit. And now I'm finally done with the face. I also added the little tufts of hair he has on the side of his cheeks. And now I'm just merging together the face object and the main object, and just filling in all the edges and bridging stuff out and making sure everything looks good. And when it does, I move on to the ears. I added a subdivision surface modifier and applied it so that it has around the same resolution as the rest of the model. And from here I just kind of extrude out some bits to cover over the last remaining area around the tip. And then I carefully retopologize those little fluffy bits around the end, essentially in the same way I did all the other pieces of fluff. I move around my main topology kind of up until a point where I make a loop around the loose bit, and then I extrude around the loop again with snapping turned off. Then like apply my shrink wrap modifier for a bit, turn snapping back on, and fill in the top. And I do that for all 3 bits. The only real thing I pay close attention to here that's different from the other places I made fur is that I try and maintain that edge loop I have going around the whole ear. There isn't really a practical reason to have that edge loop go all the way around, but I guess it's just like a matter of it feels right to have it there, so I made sure it stayed there. And with the ear pretty much done, I join that back to the rest of the head and again bridge and merge together all the edges and loops and all that. And with that, the main mesh of the head is finally fully retopologized. Well, almost, but I'll get back to that later. For now, it's time to move on to the other objects that are also part of the head. I start out with the horns. Those are actually among the easiest parts for this model to retopologize. I just add in a major loop around the sharp crease I have in the front, and extend it out a bit, and add a couple of other loops around the sides to make sure everything stays even. Then I just fill in the spaces in between, add a couple of extra edge loops, and smooth everything over, and I'm done. This part doesn't have any like odd rerouting or diamonds or even really triangles in any places. It's just one simple kind of cylindrical topology stretched over the entire model. I also fill in the top again with a grid made of quads. And now it's time for the final piece of this model that needs retopology, the hair in front of the face. It took me a while to figure out a proper workflow for this part of the model. At first I tried to work section by section, filling in the major shapes first and then adding in additional edge loops with Shift R for where I needed a bit more detail. But that didn't end up working out super well. I kind of got in my own way in some places and I struggled to figure out how to connect stuff up properly without making some weird edges. So eventually I came up with a slightly different approach. I hid all the other objects so that they wouldn't get in my way and I could just properly see the hair from all sides. And then I started going around and adding small, super thin face loops to all of the important creases and stuff all over the hair. That way I could define the major details that I need to have outlined and then fill in all the spaces in between and make sure everything connects up properly afterwards. For the hair, I paid extra close attention to making sure that all my loops going around the width of the hair connect back to where they started so I don't get some weird spirals that go all over the model. I'm not sure whether that actually matters much while rigging or deforming the mesh, but it's definitely really annoying to have spirals when you're trying to edit something. Say for example you want to add an extra edge loop to give one part a bit extra topology. If everything's connected up properly you can just use Shift R and add in an extra edge loop and you're done. But if it's not connected up you have to go around disconnecting stuff and rearranging everything to kind of somehow make it fit together again. And with the hair fully covered up in a new topology, I'm pretty much done. Well, not quite. As I mentioned earlier, I still have a couple of things I need to do. This model still has a couple of holes in it. Say for example, at the bottom of the horns, in the hair, in the eye sockets, in the mouth, and under the fur. Those aren't necessarily an issue for most models, but in this case I need the model to be fully watertight so that I can boolean all the parts together later, because the client wants to be able to pose and 3D print the model. So I apply my shrink wrap modifier and go around the mesh to make sure everything is properly smooth and maintains the same shape as the base mesh. I also check it with different matte caps, as you can see, just to make sure everything looks right. And when I'm done with that, I go around and start filling in the holes in different parts of the model. I start with the bottom of the horns because that's the most straightforward. I apply the shrink wrap modifier and all that, and even turn off snapping, and just go in and fill in the bottom with basic, like grid kind of topology, and then make some slight adjustments to the shape of the model just to make sure it fits properly. It kind of tapered in a bit at the bottom and I didn't like how that was looking. Then I move on to the hair. That's a little bit more complicated, so I don't quite apply the shrink wrap modifier and turn off snapping as quickly. I make sure I have a decently smooth outer edge. From there I do end up turning off the shrink wrap modifier and turning off clipping, or rather snapping. And then I just go in and fill in the major shapes, again with a relatively grid-like structure, making sure I keep it as much as possible quads just to avoid any weird issues. From there I head back to the main head model and quickly extrude in a bit for the nose and fill in the back end. Nothing super complicated here, the only interesting thing is that I turned off the mirror modifier for that so that I could see what I was doing. Now I start working on the mouth, specifically the lips. I hadn't sculpted anything like an interior mouth or so on my base sculpt, I just had a very basic crease where the lips meet. So now I kind of go in and extrude some extra edges and smooth stuff out so it actually looks like two separate pieces touching rather than it being just kind of one piece with a relatively sharp crease in between. With the lips looking pretty good from the outside, I go to address the major gaping hole in the bottom of the model. I turn clipping and stuff back on and go extruding out bits, essentially continuing my major retopology process, except that now, since this isn't a visible part of the mesh, I am not super worried about stuff stretching out really far, because again, it isn't going to be visible and there aren't any details here I'm trying to maintain. I try and create a relatively smooth edge around the outside, and then I fill in the whole thing with a big grid. Since there aren't any details here I'm trying to maintain, I can just keep everything very big, straightforward quads. And with that filled in, I head towards the eye sockets. I usually don't fill in eyelids, but as I mentioned, I need this mesh to be watertight, so I just quickly fill it in with a basic grid. This one is relatively high detail, but that's just because it's in the eye and I have really small, like dense quads in this part anyway. The shape ends up a bit odd, but that really doesn't matter considering you can't see in it anyway, since that's where the eye is. And now it's time for the very last bit of the model. You might have noticed earlier that I didn't fully close up the mouth, so it didn't end up being watertight, and that's because I want to make a mouth interior so it can be opened up and like the character can talk or have more interesting expressions and stuff like that. So I take a piece of the edge that I'd made in the inside of the mouth, make it into a separate object, and carefully just fill it into the very rough, crude shape of a mouth interior. It doesn't really have to have a great shape, and the topology doesn't have to be super detailed, because you really aren't going to see much of it. You're just going to notice that there is a back of the mouth. When I'm happy with how it looks, I merge it back to the main part of the head and also add in a tongue using a skin modifier. I somehow lost the footage, but the process was relatively straightforward. And now, last but not least, I model the teeth. I extrude out from a cube with a mirror modifier and add in some bevels and a subdivision surface modifier and just kind of mess around until I have the rough shape of teeth. I struggled with them a little bit, so they ended up a bit janky, and I might go in off camera and make some tweaks so they look like nice and clean and proper and they don't have any like weird artifacts or stuff like that might still be in there. But I really wanted to finish up this video, so I just kind of left them as they were for now. Oh, and one last thing I almost forgot. He actually has earrings. Luckily they are quite simple, so I could just add in some very basic toruses and move them into place to form the earrings. And with that, this part of the process is done. Retopology, for me, is probably the least fun and most time-consuming part of making a character model, but it's important, and I'm actually quite happy with how it turned out, all things considered. I'm especially happy with the mane. I already knew it was gonna be really difficult and time-consuming just while I was sculpting it, because just it has so many little pieces going in different directions, but I actually managed to figure out an approach to it, and even though it took really long, it worked out well, and it maintained all the details and stuff like that, and I'm pretty sure it'll deform fine in the end too. Hoping the body won't take quite as long, and I'm pretty sure it won't. It doesn't have nearly as many places with such tight detail, and even the places with fur, like around the hips and the tail and stuff like that, aren't nearly as big and complex as something like the mane. Being said, even if the process itself doesn't take as long, it's still gonna be a while till I upload the next video because I don't have much time to actually work on it. At the moment, I have some very important exams coming up that I need to study for, so it's gonna be a while until I upload the next part. In general, my upload schedule is probably gonna be a bit wonky for the next month or two, and I won't be uploading as frequently, probably just because I'm so busy, as I said. All being said, I hope you guys enjoyed this video and maybe even learned a thing or two from it, and I hope to see you all in the next one. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like and subscribe and all that, and maybe check out one of my other videos to the right. If you'd like to see more of my art or maybe get a commission from me, I've put links to all that in the description below. And I've also put a link to the Discord server. Anyway, I hope you have a nice day and see you all next time.